Today we are reading Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, the remarkable true story of the American capitalists who financed the Russian communists, by Anthony C. Sutton. Sutton comes to conclusions that are uncomfortable for many businessmen and economists. For this reason, his work tends to be either dismissed out of hand as extreme or more often simply ignored. Richard Pipes, Baird Professor Emeritus of History, Harvard University. Why did the 1917 American Red Cross mission to Russia include more financiers than medical doctors? Rather than caring for the victims of war and revolution, its members seemed more intent on negotiating contracts with the Kerensky government and subsequently the Bolshevik regime. In a courageous investigation, Anthony Sutton establishes tangible historical links between U.S. capitalists and Russian communists. Drawing on State Department files, personal papers of key Wall Street figures, biographies, and convention histories, Sutton reveals the role of Morgan banking executives in funneling illegal Bolshevik gold into the U.S., the co-option of the American Red Cross by powerful Wall Street forces, the intervention by Wall Street sources to free the Marxist revolution, Leon Trotsky, whose aim was to topple the Russian government, the deals made by major corporations to capture the huge Russian market a decade and a half before the U.S. recognized the Soviet regime, the secret sponsoring of communism by leading businessmen who publicly championed free enterprise. Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution traces the foundations of Western funding of the Soviet Union. Dispassionately, and with overwhelming documentation, the author details a crucial phase in the establishment of Communist Russia. This classic study, first published in 1974 and part of a key trilogy, is reproduced here in its original form. The other volumes in the series include Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler and a study of Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1933 presidential election in the United States. To those unknown Russian libertarians, also known as Greens, who in 1919 fought both the Reds and the Whites in their attempt to gain a free and voluntary Russia. Preface. Since the early 1920s, numerous pamphlets and articles, even a few books, have sought to forge a link between, quote, international bankers, unquote, and, quote, Bolshevik revolutionaries, unquote. Rarely have these attempts been supported by hard evidence, and never have such attempts been argued within the framework of a scientific methodology. Indeed, some of the evidence used in these efforts has been fraudulent. Some has been irrelevant. Much cannot be checked. Examination of the topic by academic writers has been studiously avoided, probably because the hypothesis offends the neat dichotomy of capitalists versus communists. And everyone knows, of course, that these are bitter enemies. Moreover, because a great deal in that has been written borders on the absurd, a sound academic reputation could easily be wrecked on the shoals of ridicule. Reason enough to avoid the topic. Fortunately, the State Department decimal file, particularly the 861 section, contains extensive documentation on the hypothesized link. When the evidence in these official papers is merged with non-official evidence from biographies, personal papers, and conventional histories, a truly fascinating story emerges. We find there was a link between some New York international bankers and many revolutionaries, including Bolsheviks. These banking gentlemen, who are here identified, had a financial stake in and were rooting for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. Who, why, and for how much is the story in this book. Anthony C. Sutton, March 1974. Chapter 1. The Actors on the Revolutionary Stage. Dear Mr. President, I am in sympathy with the Soviet form of government as that best suited for the Russian people. A letter to President Woodrow Wilson, October 17, 1918, from William Lawrence Saunders, Chairman, Ingersoll Rand Corp., Director, American International Corp., and Deputy Chairman, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The frontispiece in this book was drawn by cartoonist Robert Miner in 1911 for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Miner was a talented artist and writer who doubled as a Bolshevik revolutionary. Got himself arrested in Russia in 1915 for alleged subversion. This is going to be tough. This writing font is weird. For alleged subversion, and was later bankrolled by prominent Wall Street financiers. Miner's cartoon portrays a bearded, beaming Karl Marx standing in Wall Street with socialism tucked under his arm and accepting the congratulations of financial luminaries J.P. Morgan partner George W. Perkins, a smug John D. Rockefeller, John D. Ryan of National City Bank, and Teddy Roosevelt, prominently identified by the famous teeth in the background. Wall Street is decorated by red flags. The cheering crowd and the airborne hats suggest that Karl Marx must have been a fairly popular sort of fellow in the New York financial district. Was Robert Miner dreaming? On the contrary, we shall see that Miner was on firm ground in depicting an enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism. The characters in Miner's cartoon, Karl Marx, symbolizing the future revolutionaries Lenin and Trotsky, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and indeed Robert Miner himself, are also prominent characters in this book. The contradictions suggested by Miner's cartoon have been brushed under the rug of history because they do not fit the accepted conceptual spectrum of political left and political right. Bolsheviks are at the left end of the political spectrum, and Wall Street financiers are at the right end. Therefore, we implicitly reason the two groups have nothing in common, and any alliance between the two is absurd. Factors contrary to this neat conceptual arrangement are usually rejected as bizarre observations or unfortunate errors. Modern history possesses such a built-in duality, and certainly, if too many uncomfortable facts have been rejected and brushed under the rug, it is an inaccurate history. On the other hand, it may be observed that both the extreme right and the extreme left of the conventional political spectrum are absolutely collectivist. The National Socialist, for example the Fascist, and the International Socialist, for example the Communist, both recommend totalitarian politico-economic systems based on naked, unfettered political power and individual coercion. Both systems require monopoly control of society. While monopoly control of industries was once the objective of J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller, by the late 19th century, the inner sanctums of Wall Street understood that the most efficient way to gain an unchallenged monopoly was to, quote, go political, unquote, and make society go to work for the monopolists. Under the name of the public good and the public interest, this strategy was detailed in 1906 by Frederick C. Howe in his Confessions of a Monopolist. Quote, these are the rules of big business. They have superseded the teachings of our parents and are reducible to a simple maxim. Get a monopoly. Let society work for you. And remember that the best of all business is politics. For a legislative grant, franchise, subsidy, or tax exemption is worth more than a Kimberley or Comstock load, since it does not require any labor, either mental or physical, for its exploitation. Unquote. Chicago Public Publishing, 1906, page 157. Howe, by the way, is also a figure in the story of the Bolshevik Revolution. Therefore, an alternative conceptual packaging of political ideas and politico-economic systems would be that of ranking the degree of individual freedom versus the degree of centralized political control. Under such an ordering, the corporate welfare state and socialism are at the same end of the spectrum. Hence, we see that attempts at monopoly control of society can have different labels while owning common features. Consequently, one barrier to mature understanding of recent history is the notion that all capitalists are the bitter and unswerving enemies of all Marxists and socialists. This erroneous idea originated with Karl Marx and was undoubtedly useful to his purpose. In fact, the idea is nonsense. There has been a continuing, albeit concealed, alliance between international political capitalists and international revolutionary socialists to their mutual benefit. This alliance has gone unobserved largely because historians, with a few noble exceptions, have an unconscious Marxian bias and are thus locked into the impossibility of any such alliance existing. The open-minded reader should bear two clues in mind. Monopoly capitalists are the bitter enemies of laissez-faire entrepreneurs. And, given the weaknesses of socialist central planning, the totalitarian socialist state is a perfect captive market for monopoly capitalists, if an alliance can be made with the socialist power brokers. Suppose, and it is only a hypothesis at this point, that American monopoly capitalists were able to reduce a planned socialist Russia to the status of a captive technical colony. Would not this be the logical 20th century internationalist extension of the Morgan Railroad monopolies and the Rockefeller Petroleum Trust of the late 19th century? Apart from Gabriel Kolko, Murray Rothbard, and the revisionists, historians have not been alert for such a combination of events. Historical reporting, with rare exceptions, has been forced into a dichotomy of capitalists versus socialists. George Kennan's monumental and readable study of the Russian Revolution consistently maintains this fiction of a Wall Street Bolshevik dichotomy. George F. Kennan, Russia Leaves the War, New York, Athenaeum, 1967, and Decision to Intervene, Soviet-American Relations, 1917 to 1920, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1958. Russia Leaves the War has a single incidental reference to the J.P. Morgan firm and no reference at all to Guarantee Trust Company. Yet, both organizations are prominently mentioned in the State Department files, to which frequent reference is made in this book, and both are part of the core of the evidence presented here. Neither self-admitted, quote, Bolshevik banker, unquote, Olaf Ashberg, nor Nia Bankin in Stockholm is mentioned in Kennan, yet both were central to Bolshevik funding. Moreover, in minor yet crucial circumstances, at least crucial for our argument, Kennan is factually in error. For example, Kennan cites Federal Reserve Bank Director William Boyce Thompson as leaving Russia on November 27, 1917. This departure date would make it physically impossible for Thompson to be in Petrograd on December 2nd, 1917, to transmit a cable request for $1 million to Morgan in New York. Thompson in fact left Petrograd on December 4th, 1918, 2 days after sending the cable to New York. It says 1918. But I think he meant 17. I digress. 2 days after sending the cable to New York. Then again, Kennan states that on November 30th, 1917, Trotsky delivered a speech before the Petrograd Soviet in which he observed, quote, "Today I had here in the Smolny Institute 2 Americans closely connected with American capitalist elements," unquote. According to Kennan, it, quote, "is difficult to imagine," unquote, "who these 2 Americans," quote, "could have been, if not Robbins and Gumberg," unquote. But in fact, Alexander Gumberg was Russian, not American. Further, as Thompson was still in Russia on November 30th, 1917, then the 2 Americans who visited Trotsky were more than likely Raymond Robbins, a mining promoter turned do-gooder, and Thompson of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Bolshevikization of Wall Street was known among well-informed circles as early as 1919. The financial journalist Barron recorded a conversation with oil magnate E.H. Doheny in 1919 and specifically named 3 prominent financiers, William Boyce Thompson, Thomas Lamont, and Charles R. Crane, aboard SS Aquitania, Friday evening, February 1, 1919. "Spent the evening with the Dohenys in their suite," Mr. Doheny said. If you believe in democracy, you cannot believe in socialism. Socialism is the poison that destroys democracy. Democracy means opportunity for all. Socialism holds out the hope that a man can quit work and be better off. Bolshevism is the true fruit of socialism, and if you will read the interesting testimony before the Senate committee about the middle of January that showed up all of these pacifists and peacemakers as German sympathizers, socialists, and Bolsheviks, you will see that a majority of the college professors in the United States are teaching socialism and Bolshevism, and that 52 college professors were on so-called peace committees in 1914. President Eliot of Harvard is teaching Bolshevism. The worst Bolshevists in the United States are not only college professors, of whom President Wilson is one, but capitalists and the wives of capitalists, and neither seem to know what they are talking about. William Boyce Thompson is teaching Bolshevism, and he may yet convert Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company. Vanderlip is a Bolshevist. So is Charles R. Crane. Many women are joining the movement, and neither they nor their husbands know what it is or what it leads to. Henry Ford is another, and so are most of those 100 historians Wilson took abroad with him in the foolish idea that history can teach youth proper demarcations of races, peoples, and nations geographically. Arthur Pound and Samuel Taylor Moore, They Told Barron. New York, Harper and Brothers, 1930, pages 13 and 14. In brief, this is a story of the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath, but a story that departs from the usual conceptual straitjacket approach of capitalists versus communists. Our story postulates a partnership between international monopoly capitalism and international revolutionary socialism for their mutual benefit. The final human cost of this alliance has fallen upon the shoulders of the individual Russian and the individual American. Entrepreneurship has been brought into disrepute, and the world has been propelled toward inefficient socialist planning as a result of these monopoly maneuverings in the world of politics and revolution. This is also a story reflecting the betrayal of the Russian Revolution. The Tsars and their corrupt political system were rejected only to be replaced by the new power brokers of another corrupt political system. Where the United States could have exerted its dominant influence to bring about a free Russia, it truckled to the ambitions of a few Wall Street financiers who, for their own purposes, could accept the centralized Tsarist Russia or a centralized Marxist Russia, but not a decentralized free Russia. And the reasons for these assertions will unfold as we develop, and the underlying and, so far, untold history of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. There is a parallel, and also unknown, history with respect to the Makhanovite movement that fought both the Whites and the Reds in the Civil War of 1919 through 1920. C. Valine, The Unknown Revolution, New York Libertarian Book Club, 1953. There was also the, quote, Green Movement, unquote, Green Movement, which fought both Whites and Reds. The author has never seen even one isolated mention of the Greens in any history of the Bolshevik Revolution. Yet the Green Army was at least 700,000 strong. Chapter 2. Trotsky leaves New York to complete the revolution. You will have a revolution, a terrible revolution. What course it takes will spend much on what Mr. Rockefeller tells Mr. Haig to do. Mr. Rockefeller is a symbol of the American ruling class, and Mr. Haig is a symbol of its political tools. Leon Trotsky, in New York Times, December 13, 1938. Haig was a New Jersey politician. In 1916, the year preceding the Russian Revolution, internationalists, Leon Trotsky was expelled from France, officially because of his participation in the Zimmerwald Conference, but also no doubt because of inflammatory articles written for Naše Slovo, a Russian-language newspaper printed in Paris. In September 1916, Trotsky was politely escorted across the Spanish border by French police. A few days later, Madrid police arrested the internationalist and lodged him in a, quote, first-class cell, unquote, at a charge of 1.5 pesetas per day. Subsequently, Trotsky was taken to Cadiz, then to Barcelona, finally to be placed on board the Spanish transatlantic company steamer Montserrat. Trotsky and family crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed in New York on January 13, 1917. Other Trotskyites also made their way westward across the Atlantic. Indeed, one Trotsky group acquired sufficient immediate influence in Mexico to write the Constitution of Querétaro for the revolutionary 1917 Carranza government, giving Mexico the dubious distinction of being the first government in the world to adopt a Soviet-type constitution. How did Trotsky, who knew only German and Russian, survive in capitalist America? According to his autobiography, My Life, quote, my only profession in New York was that of a revolutionary socialist, unquote. In other words, Trotsky wrote occasional articles for Novy Mir, the New York Russian Socialist Journal. Yet we know that the Trotsky family apartment in New York had a refrigerator and a telephone, and, according to Trotsky, that the family occasionally traveled in a chauffeured limousine. This mode of living puzzled the two young Trotsky boys when they went into a tea room. When they went into a tea room, the boys would anxiously demand of the mother, quote, why doesn't the chauffeur come in? Unquote. Leon Trotsky, My Life, New York Scribners, 1930, Chapter 22. The stylish living standard is also at odds with Trotsky's reported income. The only funds that Trotsky admits receiving in 1916 and 1917 are $310. And, said Trotsky, quote, I distributed the $310 among 5 immigrants who were returning to Russia, unquote. Yet, Trotsky had paid for a first-class cell in Spain. The Trotsky family had traveled across Europe to the United States. They had acquired an excellent apartment in New York, paying rent 3 months in advance, and they had use of a chauffeured limousine. All this on the earnings of an impoverished revolutionary for a few articles for the low-circulation Russian-language newspaper Naše Slovo in Paris and Nový Mir in New York. Joseph Nedeva estimates Trotsky's 1917 income at $12 per week, quote, supplemented by some lecture fees, unquote. Joseph Nedava, Trotsky and the Jews, Philadelphia, Jewish Publication Society of America, 1972, page 163. Trotsky was in New York in 1917 for 3 months, from January to March. So that makes $144 in income from Nový Mir and say another $100 in lecture fees for a total of $244. Of this $244, Trotsky was able to give away $310 to his friends, pay for the New York apartment, provide for his family, and find the $10,000 that was taken from him in April 1917 by Canadian authorities in Halifax. Trotsky claims that those who said he had other sources of income are, quote, slanderers, unquote, spreading, quote, stupid calumnies, unquote, and lies. But unless Trotsky was playing the horses at the Jamaica racetrack, it can't be done. Obviously, Trotsky had an unreported source of income. What was that source? In The Road to Safety, author Arthur Willett says Trotsky earned a living by working as an electrician for Fox Film Studios. Other writers have cited other occupations, but there is no evidence that Trotsky occupied himself for remuneration, otherwise than by writing and speaking. Most investigation has centered on the verifiable fact that when Trotsky left New York in 1917 for Petrograd to organize the Bolshevik phase of the revolution, he left with $10,000. In 1919, the U.S. Senate Overman Committee investigated Bolshevik propaganda and German money in the United States, and incidentally touched on the source of Trotsky's $10,000. Examination of Colonel Herbin, Washington attaché to the Czech legation by the Overman Committee, yielded the following. Colonel Herbin, Trotsky perhaps took money from Germany, but Trotsky will deny it. Lenin would not deny it. Milikov proved that he got $10,000 from some Germans while he was in America. Milikov had the proof, but he denied it. Trotsky did, although Milikov had the proof. Senator Overman, it was charged that Trotsky got $10,000 here. Colonel Herbin, I do not remember how much it was, but I know it was a question between him and Milikov. Senator Overman, Milikov proved it, did he? Colonel Herbin, yes, sir. Senator Overman, do you know where he got it from? Colonel Herbin, I remember it was $10,000, but it is no matter. I will speak about their propaganda. The German government knew Russia better than anybody, and they knew that with the help of those people, they could destroy the Russian army. At 5:45 p.m., the subcommittee adjourned until tomorrow, Wednesday, February 19th, at 10:30 a.m. United States Senate, Brewing and Liquor Interests, and German and Bolshevik Propaganda. Subcommittee on the Judiciary, 65th Congress, 1919. It is quite remarkable that the committee adjourned abruptly before the source of Trotsky's funds could be placed into the Senate record. When questioning resumed the next day, Trotsky and his $10,000 were no longer of interest to the Overman Committee. We shall later develop evidence concerning the financing of German and revolutionary activities in the United States by New York financial houses. The origins of Trotsky's $10,000 will then come into focus. An amount of $10,000 of German origin is also mentioned in the official British telegram to Canadian naval authorities in Halifax, who requested that Trotsky and party en route to the revolution be taken off the SS Christiania Fjord. See page 28. We also learned from a British Directorate of Intelligence report, Special Report Number 5, the Russian-Soviet Bureau of the United States, July 14, 19, Scotland House, London, SWI copy in the U.S. State Department, decimal file 3/16/23/1145, that Gregory Weinstein, who in 1919 was to become a prominent member of the Soviet Bureau in New York, collected funds for Trotsky in New York. These funds originated in Germany and were channeled through the Bolshevik Sutton, a German daily newspaper in New York and subsidized by the German government. While Trotsky's funds are officially reported as German, Trotsky was actively engaged in American politics immediately prior to leaving New York for Russia and the Revolution. On March 5, 1917, American newspapers headlined the increasing possibility of war with Germany. The same evening, Trotsky proposed a resolution at the meeting of the New York County Socialist Party, quote, pledging socialists to encourage strikes and resist recruiting in the event of war with Germany, unquote. New York Times, March 5, 1917. Leon Trotsky was called by the New York Times, quote, an exiled Russian revolutionist, unquote. Louis C. Freyna, who corresponded the Trotsky Revolution, later, under an alias, wrote an uncritical book on the Morgan financial empire entitled House of Morgan. Louis Corey, House of Morgan, a social biography of the masters of money, New York, G. W. Watt, 1930. The Trotsky-Freyna proposal was opposed by the Morris-Hillquit faction, and the Socialist Party subsequently voted opposition to the resolution. Morris-Hillquit, formerly Hilkowitz, had been defense attorney for Johann Most after the assassination of President McKinley, and in 1917 was a leader of the New York Socialist Party. In the 1920s, Hillquit established himself in the New York banking world by becoming a director of and attorney for the International Union Bank. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Hillquit helped draw up the NRA codes for the garment industry. More than a week later, on March 16th, at the time of the deposition of the Tsar, Leon Trotsky was interviewed in the offices of Novy Mir. The interview contained a prophetic statement on the Russian Revolution. Quote, the committee which has taken the place of the deposed ministry in Russia did not represent the interests or the aims of the revolutionists, that it would probably be short-lived, and step down in favor of men who would be more sure to carry forward the democratization of Russia. New York Times, March 16, 1917. The quote, men who would be more sure to carry forward the democratization of Russia, unquote, that is, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, were then in exile abroad and needed first to return to Russia. The temporary, quote, committee, unquote, was therefore dubbed the Provisional Government, a title, it should be noted, that was used from the start of the revolution in March and not applied ex post facto by historians. Woodrow Wilson, and a passport for Trotsky. President Woodrow Wilson was the fairy godmother who provided Trotsky with a passport to return Russia to, quote, carry forward, unquote, the revolution. This American passport was accompanied by a Russian entry permit and a British transit visa. Jennings C. Wise in Woodrow Wilson, Disciple of Revolution, makes the pertinent comment, quote, historians must never forget that Woodrow Wilson, despite the efforts of the British police, made it possible for Leon Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport, unquote. President Wilson facilitated Trotsky's passage to Russia. At the same time, careful State Department bureaucrats, concerned about such revolutionaries entering Russia, were unilaterally attempting to tighten up passport procedures. The Stockholm legation cabled the State Department on June 13, 1917, just after Trotsky crossed the Finnish-Russian border. Quote, legation confidentially informed Russian, English, and French passport offices at Russian frontier, Tornia, considerably worried by passage of suspicious persons bearing American passports. Unquote. U.S. State Department, decimal file 316-85-1002. To this cable, the State Department replied on the same day, quote, Department is exercising special care in issuance of passports for Russia, unquote. The department also authorized expenditures by the legation to establish a passport control office in Stockholm and to hire an, quote, absolutely dependable American citizen, unquote, for employment on control work, IBID. But the bird had flown the coop. Menshik Trotsky with Lenin's Bolsheviks were already in Russia preparing to, quote, carry forward, unquote, the revolution. The passport net erected caught only more legitimate birds. For example, on June 26, 1917, Herman Bernstein, a reputable New York newspaperman, on his way to Petrograd to represent the New York Herald, was held at the border and refused entry to Russia. Somewhat tardily, in mid-August 1917, the Russian embassy in Washington requested the State Department, and State agreed, to, quote, prevent the entry into Russia of criminals and anarchists, numbers of whom have already gone to Russia, unquote. IBID 861.111/315. Consequently, by virtue of preferential treatment for Trotsky, when the SS Christiane Ford left New York on March 26, 1917, Trotsky was aboard and holding a U.S. passport, and in company with other Trotskyite revolutionaries, Wall Street financiers, American communists, and other interesting persons, few of whom had embarked for legitimate business. The mixed bag of passengers had been described by Lincoln Steffens, the American communist. Quote, the passenger list was long and mysterious. Trotsky was in the steerage with a group of revolutionaries. There was a Japanese revolutionist in my cabin. There were a lot of Dutch hurrying home from Java, the only innocent people aboard. The rest were war messengers, 2 from Wall Street to Germany. Lincoln Steffens' autobiography, New York, Harcourt Brace, 1931, page 764. Steffens was the, quote, go-between, unquote, for Crane and Woodrow Wilson. Notably, Lincoln Steffens was on board en route to Russia at the specific invitation of Charles Richard Crane, a backer and a former chairman of the Democratic Party's Finance Committee. Charles Crane, vice president of the Crane Company, had organized the Westinghouse Company in Russia, was a member of the Root Mission to Russia, and had made no fewer than 23 visits to Russia between 1890 and 1930. Richard Crane, his son, was confidential assistant to the Secretary of State Robert Lansing. According to the former ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, Crane, quote, did much to bring on the Kerensky Revolution, which gave way to communism. William Edward Dodd, Ambassador Dodd's Diary, 1933 to 1938. New York, Harcourt Brace, 1941, pages 42 and 43. And so Steffens comments in his diary about conversations aboard the SS Christiania Ford are highly pertinent. Quote, all agree that the revolution is in its first phase only, that it must grow. Crane and Russian radicals on the ship think we shall be in Petrograd for the re-revolution, unquote. Lincoln Steffens, The Letters of Lincoln Steffens, New York, Harcourt Brace, 1941, page 396. Crane returned to the United States when the Bolshevik Revolution, that is, the re-revolution, had been completed, and although a private citizen, was given first-hand reports of the progress of the Bolshevik Revolution as cables were received at the State Department. For example, one memorandum dated December 11, 1917, is entitled, quote, Copy of Report on Maximalist Uprising for Mr. Crane, unquote. It originated with Madden Summers, U.S. Consul General in Moscow, and the covering letter from Summers reads, in part, quote, I have the honor to enclose herewith a copy of same, above report, with the request that it be sent for the confidential information of Mr. Charles R. Crane. It is assumed that the Department will have no objection to Mr. Crane seeing the report. U.S. State Department Decimal File 861.00/1026. In brief, the unlikely and puzzling picture that emerges is that Charles Crane, a friend and backer of Woodrow Wilson and a prominent financier and politician, had a known role in the, quote, first, unquote, revolution, and traveled to Russia in mid-1917 in company with the American communist Lincoln Steffens, who was in touch with both Woodrow Wilson and Trotsky. The latter, in turn, was carrying a passport issued at the orders of Wilson and $10,000 from supposed German sources. On his return to the U.S. after the, quote, re-revolution, unquote, Crane was granted access to official documents concerning consolidation of the Bolshevik regime. This is a pattern of interlocking, if puzzling, events that warrants further investigation and suggests, though without at this point providing evidence, some link between the financier Crane and the revolutionary Trotsky. Canadian government documents on Trotsky's release. This section is based on Canadian government records. Documents on Trotsky's brief stay in Canadian custody are now declassified and available from the Canadian Government Archives. According to these archives, Trotsky was removed by Canadian and British naval personnel from the SS Christiania Ford at Halifax, Nova Scotia on April 3, 1917, listed as a German prisoner of war, and interned at the Amherst, Nova Scotia, internment station for German prisoners. Miss Trotsky and the two Trotsky boys, and 5 other men described as, quote, Russian socialists, unquote, were also taken off and interned. Their names are recorded by the Canadian files as Nikita Muchin, Libya Fishilev, Konstantin Romanchuk, Gregor Tiadonovsky, Gershon Molichansky, and Leon Bronstein Trotsky, all spellings from original Canadian documents. Canadian Army Form LB1 under serial number 1098, including thumbprints, was completed for Trotsky with a description as follows. 37 years old, a political exile, occupation journalist, born in Gromsky, Chusan, Russia, Russian citizen. The form was signed by Leon Trotsky, and his full name given as Leon Bromstein Sikh Trotsky. The Trotsky Party was removed from the SS Christian Ford under official instructions received by cablegram of March 29, 1917. London, presumably originating in the Admiralty with the Naval Control Officer, Halifax. The cablegram reported that the Trotsky Party was on the Christian Ford and should be taken off, retained, pending instructions. The reason given to the Naval Control Officer at Halifax was that, quote, these are Russian socialists leaving for purposes of starting a revolution against the present Russian government, for which Trotsky is reported to have $10,000 subscribed by socialists and Germans, unquote. On April 1st, 1917, the Naval Control Officer, Captain O.M. Makins, sent a confidential memorandum to the General Officer commanding at Halifax to the effect that he had, quote, examined all Russian passengers, unquote, aboard the SS Christian Ford and found 6 men in the second class section. Quote, they are all avowed socialists, and though professing a desire to help the new Russian government, might well be in league with German socialists in America, and quite likely to be a great hindrance to the government in Russia just at present, unquote. Captain Makins added that he was going to remove the group, as well as Trotsky's wife and 2 sons, in order to intern them at Halifax. A copy of this report was forwarded from Halifax to the Chief of the General Staff in Ottawa on April 2, 1917. The next document in the Canadian files is dated April 7, from the Chief of the General Staff, Ottawa, to the Director of Internment Operations, and acknowledges a previous letter, not in the files, about the internment of Russian socialists at Amherst, Nova Scotia. Quote, in this connection, have to inform you of the receipt of a long telegram yesterday from the Russian Consul General, Montreal, protesting against the arrest of these men as they are in possession of passports issued by the Russian Consul General, New York, USA, unquote. The reply to this Montreal telegram was to the effect that the men were interned, quote, on suspicion of being German, unquote, and would be released only upon definite proof of their nationality and loyalty to the Allies. No telegrams from the Russian Consul General in New York are in the Canadian files, and it is known that the office was reluctant to issue Russian passports to Russian political exiles. However, there is a telegram in the files from a New York attorney, N. Alenikoff, to R.M. Coulter, then Deputy Postmaster General of Canada. The Postmaster General's office in Canada had no connection with either internment of prisoners of war or military activities. Accordingly, this telegram was in nature of a personal, non-official intervention. It reads, quote, Dr. R.M. Coulter, Postmaster General, Ottawa, Russian political exiles returning to Russia detained Halifax interned Amherst camp. Kindly investigate and advise cause of the detention and names of all detained. Trust this champion of freedom. You will intercede on their behalf. Please wire collect. Nicholas Aleniakov, unquote. On April 11th, Coulter wired Aleniakov, quote, telegram received, writing this afternoon. You should receive it tomorrow evening. R.M. Coulter, unquote. This telegram was sent by the Canadian Pacific Railway Telegraph but charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. Normally, a private business telegram would be charged to the recipient, and this was not official business. The follow-up Coulter letter to Aleniakov is interesting because after confirming that the Trotsky Party was held at Amherst, it states that they were suspected of propaganda against the present Russian government and, quote, are supposed to be agents of Germany, unquote. Coulter then adds, quote, they are not what they represent themselves to be, unquote. The Trotsky group is, quote, not detained by Canada, but by the imperial authorities, unquote. After assuring Aleniakov that the detainees would be made comfortable, Coulter adds that any information, quote, in their favor, unquote, would be transmitted to the military authorities. The general impression of the letter is that while Coulter is sympathetic and fully aware of Trotsky's pro-German links, he is unwilling to get involved. On April 11th, Arthur Wolfe of 134 East Broadway, New York, sent a telegram to Coulter. Though sent from New York, this telegram, after being acknowledged, was also charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. Coulter's reactions, however, reflect more than detached sympathy evident in his letter to Aleniakov. They must be considered in the light of the fact that these letters on behalf of Trotsky came from two American residents of New York City and involved a Canadian or imperial military matter of international importance. Further, Coulter, as Deputy Postmaster General, was a Canadian government official of some standing. Ponder for a moment what would happen to someone who similarly intervened in United States affairs. In the Trotsky affair, we have two American residents corresponding with the Canadian Deputy Postmaster General in order to intervene in behalf of the interned Russian revolutionary. Coulter's subsequent action also suggests something more than casual intervention. After Coulter acknowledged the Aleniakov and Wolfe telegrams, he wrote to Major General Willoughby Gwatkin of the Department of Militia and Defense in Ottawa, a man of significant influence in the Canadian military, and attached copies of the Aleniakov and Wolfe telegrams. Quote, these men have been hostile to Russia because of the way the Jews have been treated, and are now strongly in favor of the present administration, so far as I know. Both are responsible men, both are reputable men, and I'm sending their telegrams to you for what they may be worth, and so that you may represent them to the English authorities if you deem it wise, unquote. Obviously, Coulter knows, or intimates that he knows, a great deal about Aleniakov and Wolfe. His letter was in effect a character reference and aimed at the root of the internment problem, London. Gwatkin was well known in London, and in fact was on loan to Canada from the War Office in London. Gwatkin's memoranda in the Canadian government files are not signed, but initialed with a cryptic mark or symbol. The mark has been identified as Gwatkin's because one Gwatkin letter, that of April 21st, with the cryptic mark, was acknowledged. Aleniakov then sent a letter to Coulter to thank him. Quote, most heartily for the interest you have taken in the fate of the Russian political exiles. You know me, esteemed Dr. Coulter, and you also know my devotion to the cause of Russian freedom. Happily I know Mr. Trotsky, Mr. Melnichansky, and Mr. Chudnowiski intimately, unquote. It might be noted as an aside that if Aleniakov knew Trotsky, quote, intimately, unquote, then he would also probably be aware that Trotsky had declared his intention to return to Russia to overthrow the provisional government and institute the, quote, re-revolution, unquote. On receipt of Aleniakov's letter, Coulter immediately, April 16th, forwarded it to the Major General Gwatkin, adding that he became acquainted with Aleniakov, quote, in connection with the departmental action on United States papers in the Russian language, unquote, and that Aleniakov was working, quote, on the same lines as Mr. Wolfe, who was an escaped prisoner from Siberia, unquote. Previously, on April 14th, Gwatkin sent a memorandum to his naval counterpart on the Canadian Military Interdepartmental Committee, repeating that the internees were Russian socialists with, quote, $10,000 subscribed by socialists and Germans, unquote. The concluding paragraph stated, quote, on the other hand, there are those who declare that an act of high-handed injustice has been done, unquote. Then on April 16th, Vice Admiral C.E. Kingsmill, director of the Naval Service, took Gwakin's intervention at face value. In a letter to Captain Makins, the Naval Control Officer at Halifax, he stated, quote, the militia authorities request that a decision as to their, that is, the 6 Russians, disposal may be hastened, unquote. A copy of this instruction was relayed to Gwakin, who in turn informed Deputy Postmaster General Coulter. 3 days later, Gwakin applied pressure. In a memorandum of April 20th to the Naval Secretary, he wrote, quote, can you say, please, whether or not the Naval Control Office has given a decision, unquote. On the same day, April 20, Captain Makins wrote Admiral Kingsmill explaining his reasons for removing Trotsky. He refused to be pressured into making a decision, stating, quote, I will cable to the Admiralty informing them that the militia authorities are requesting an early decision as to their disposal, unquote. However, the next day, April 21st, Gwakin wrote Coulter, quote, our friends, the Russian socialists, are to be released, and arrangements are being made for their passage to Europe, unquote. The order to Makins for Trotsky's release originated in the Admiralty, London. Coulter acknowledged the information, quote, which will please our New York correspondents immensely, unquote. While we can, on the one hand, conclude that Coulter and Gwakin are intensely interested in the release of Trotsky, we do not, on the other hand, know why. There was little in the career of either Deputy Postmaster General Coulter or Major General Gwakin that would explain an urge to release the Menshevik Leon Trotsky. Dr. Robert Miller Coulter was a medical doctor of Scottish and Irish parents, a liberal, a Freemason, and an Oddfellow. He was appointed Deputy Postmaster General of Canada in 1897. His sole claim to fame derived from being a delegate to the Universal Post Union Convention in 1906, and a delegate to New Zealand and Australia in 1908 for the, quote, All Red Project, unquote. All Red had nothing to do with the Red Revolutionaries. It was only a plan for all Red or all British fast steamships between Great Britain, Canada, and Australia. Major General Willoughby Gwakin stemmed from a long British military tradition, Cambridge and then Staff College. A specialist in mobilization, he served in Canada from 1905 to 1918. Given only the documents in the Canadian files, we can but conclude that their intervention in behalf of Trotsky is a mystery. Canadian military intelligence views Trotsky. We can approach the Trotsky release case from another angle. Canadian intelligence. Lieutenant Colonel John Bain Maclean, a prominent Canadian publisher and businessman, founder and president of Maclean Publishing Company, Toronto, operated numerous Canadian trade journals, including the Financial Post. Maclean also had a long-time association with Canadian Army Intelligence. H.J. Morgan, Canadian Men and Women of the Times, 1912, 2 volumes, Toronto, W. Briggs, 1898 through 1912. In 1918, Colonel Maclean wrote for his own Maclean's magazine an article entitled, quote, Why Did We Let Trotsky Go? How Canada Lost an Opportunity to Shorten the War, unquote. June 1919, pages 66A through 666. Toronto Public Library has a copy. The issue of Maclean's in which Colonel McLean's article appeared is not easy to find, and a full summary is provided. The article contained detailed and unusual information about Leon Trotsky, although the last half of the piece wanders off into space, remarking about barely related matters. We have two clues to the authenticity of the information. First, Colonel McLean was a man of integrity with excellent connections in Canadian government intelligence. Second, government records since released by Canada, Great Britain, and the United States confirm McLean's statement to a significant degree. Some McLean statements remain to be confirmed, but information available in the early 1970s is not necessarily inconsistent with Colonel McLean's article. McLean's opening argument is that, quote, some Canadian politicians or officials were chiefly responsible for the prolongation of the war, World War I, for the great loss of life, the wounds and sufferings of the winter of 1917, and the great drives of 1918, unquote. Further states McLean, these persons were, in 1919, doing everything possible to prevent Parliament and the Canadian people from getting the related facts. Official reports, including those of Sir Douglas Haig, demonstrate that but for the Russian break in 1917, the war would have been over a year earlier, and that, quote, the man chiefly responsible for the defection of Russia was Trotsky, acting under German instructions, unquote. Who was Trotsky? According to McLean, Trotsky was not Russian, but German. Odd as this assertion may appear, it does coincide with other scraps of intelligence information. To wit, that Trotsky spoke better German than Russian, and that he was the Russian executive of the German, quote, Black Bond, unquote. According to McLean, according to McLean, Trotsky in August 1914 had been ostentatiously expelled from Berlin. See also Trotsky, My Life, page 236. He finally arrived in the United States, where he organized Russian revolutionaries, as well as revolutionaries in Western Canada, who were, quote, were largely Germans and Austrians traveling as Russians, unquote. McLean continues, quote, originally, the British found through Russian associates that Kerensky, see Appendix 3, Lenin, and some lesser leaders were practically in German pay as early as 1915, and they uncovered in 1916 the connections with Trotsky, then living in New York. From that time, he was closely watched by the bomb squad. In the early part of 1916, a German official sailed for New York. British intelligence officials accompanied him. He was held up at Halifax, but on their instructions he was passed on with the profuse apologies for the necessary delay. After much maneuvering, he arrived in a dirty little newspaper office in the slums, and there found Trotsky, to whom he bore important instructions. From June 1916 until they passed him on to the British, the New York bomb squad never lost touch with Trotsky. They discovered that his real name was Brunstein and that he was a German, not a Russian. According to his own account, Trotsky did not arrive in the U.S. until January 1917. Trotsky's real name was Bronstein. He invented the name Trotsky. Bronstein is German and Trotsky is Polish rather than Russian. His first name is usually given as Leon. However, Trotsky's first book, which was published in Geneva, has the initial N, not L. Such German activity in neutral countries is confirmed in a State Department report. 316-9-764-9, describing organization of Russian refugees for revolutionary purposes. Continuing, McLean states that Trotsky and 4 associates sailed on the SS Christiania and on April 3rd reported to Captain Making and were taken off the ship at Halifax under the direction of Lieutenant Jones. Actually, a party of 9, including 6 men, were taken off the SS Christiania Fjord. The name of the naval control officer at Halifax was Captain O.M. Makins, R.N. The name of the officer who removed the Trotsky party from the ship is not in the Canadian government documents. Trotsky said it was Machen. Again, according to McLean, Trotsky's money came, quote, from German sources in New York, unquote. Also, generally the explanation given is that the release was done at the request of Kerensky, but months before the British officers and 1 Canadian serving in Russia, who could speak the Russian language, reported to London and Washington that Kerensky was in German service. See Appendix 3. This document was obtained in 1971 from the British Foreign Office, but apparently was known to McLean. Trotsky was released, quote, at the request of the British Embassy at Washington, which acted on the request of the U.S. State Department, who were acting for someone else, unquote. Canadian officials, quote, were instructed to inform the press that Trotsky was an American citizen traveling on an American passport, that his release was specifically demanded by the Washington State Department, unquote. Moreover, writes McLean in Ottawa, quote, Trotsky had and continues to have strong underground influence. There his power was so great that orders were issued that he must be given every consideration, unquote. The theme of McLean's reporting is, quite evidently, that Trotsky had intimate relations with, and probably worked for, the German General Staff. While such relations have been established regarding Lenin, to the extent that Lenin was subsidized in his return to Russia facilitated by the Germans, it appears certain that Trotsky was similarly aided. The $10,000 Trotsky Fund in New York was from German sources, and a recently declassified document in the United States Department file reads as follows. March 9, 1918, to American Consul Vladivostok from Polk, Acting Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. For your confidential information and prompt attention, following a substance of message of January 12th from von Schanz of German Imperial Bank to Trotsky, quote, consent Imperial Bank to appropriation from Credit General Staff of 5 million rubles for sending Assistant Chief Naval Commissioner Kudryashev to Far East, unquote. The message suggests some liaison between Trotsky and the Germans in January 1918, a time when Trotsky was proposing an alliance with the West. The State Department does not give the provenance of the telegram, only that it originated with the War College staff. The State Department did treat the message as authentic and acted on the basis of assumed authenticity. It is consistent with the general theme of Colonel McLean's article. Trotsky's intentions and objectives. Consequently, we can derive the following sequence of events. Trotsky traveled from New York to Petrograd on a passport supplied by the intervention of Woodrow Wilson, and with the declared intention to, quote, carry forward, unquote, the revolution. The British government was the immediate source of Trotsky's release from Canadian custody in April 1917, but there may well have been, quote, pressures, unquote. Lincoln Steffens, an American communist, acted as a link between Wilson and Charles R. Crane, between Crane and Trotsky. Further, while Crane had no official position, his son Richard was confidential assistant to Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and Crane Sr. was provided with prompt and detailed reports on the progress of the Bolshevik Revolution. Moreover, Ambassador William Dodd, U.S. Ambassador to Germany in the Hitler era, said that Crane had an active role in the Kerensky phase of the revolution. The Steffens letters confirmed that Crane saw the Kerensky phase as only one step in continuing the revolution. Only one step in a continuing revolution. The interesting point, however, is not so much the communication among dissimilar persons like Crane, Steffens, Trotsky, and Woodrow Wilson as the existence of at least a measure of agreement on the procedure to be followed. That is, the provisional government was seen as a provisional, and the revolution was to follow. On the other side of the coin, interpretation of Trotsky's intentions should be cautious. He was adept at double games. Official documentation clearly demonstrates contradictory actions. For example, the Division of Far Eastern Affairs of the United States State Department received on March 23, 1918, 2 reports stemming from Trotsky. One is inconsistent with the other. One report, dated March 20 and from Moscow, originated in the Russian newspaper Rusko Slovo. The report cited an interview with Trotsky in which he stated that any alliance with the United States was impossible. Quote, "The Russia of the Soviet cannot align itself with capitalistic America, for this would be a betrayal. It is possible the Americans seek such a rapprochement with us, driven by its antagonism towards Japan, but in any case there can be no questions of an alliance by us of any nature with a bourgeoisie nation." U.S. State Department Decimal File 861, period 00/1351. The other report, also originating in Moscow, is a message dated March 17, 1918, 3 days earlier, and from Ambassador Francis. Quote, "Trotsky requests 5 American officers as inspectors of army being organized for defense, also requests railroad operating men and equipment." Unquote. U.S. State Department Decimal File 861, period 00/1341. This request to the U.S. is, of course, inconsistent with rejection of an, quote, "alliance," unquote. Before we leave Trotsky, some mention should be made of the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s and, in particular, the 1938 accusations and trial of the, quote, "anti-Soviet bloc of rightists and Trotskyists," unquote. These forced parodies of the judicial process, almost unanimously rejected in the West, may throw light on Trotsky's intentions. The crux of the Stalinist accusation was that Trotskyites were paid agents of international capitalism. K.G. Rakovsky, one of the 1938 defendants, said, or was induced to say, quote, "We were the vanguard of foreign aggression, of international fascism, and not only in the USSR, but also in Spain, China, throughout the world," unquote. The summation of the, quote, "court," unquote, contains the statement, quote, "There is not a single man in the world who brought so much sorrow and misfortune to people as Trotsky. He is the vilest agent of fascism," unquote. Report of court proceedings in the case of anti-Soviet bloc of rightists and Trotskyists, heard before the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, Moscow, People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR, 1938, pages 293. Now, while this may be no more than verbal insults routinely traded among the international communists of the 1930s and 40s, it is also notable that the threads behind the self-accusation are consistent with the evidence in this chapter. And further, as we shall later see, Trotsky was able to generate support among international capitalists, who, incidentally, were also supporters of Mussolini and Hitler. See page 174 Thomas Lamont of the Morgans, was an early supporter of Mussolini. So long as we see all international revolutionaries and all international capitalists as implacable enemies of one another, then we miss a crucial point, that there has indeed been some operational cooperation between international capitalists, including fascists, and there is no a priori reason why we should reject Trotsky as a part of this alliance. This tentative, limited reassessment will be brought into sharp focus when we review the story of Michael Grusenberg, the chief Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia, who under the alias of Alexander Gumberg was also confidential advisor to the Chase National Bank in New York, and later to Floyd Udlum of Atlas Corporation. This dual role was known to and accepted by both the Soviets and his American employers. The Grusenberg story is a case history of international revolution allied with international capitalism. Colonel McLean's observations that Trotsky had, quote, strong underground influence, unquote, and that his, quote, power was so great that orders were issued that he must be given every consideration, unquote, are not at all inconsistent with the Coulter-Gautkin intervention in Trotsky's behalf, or, for that matter, with those latter occurrences, the Stalinist accusations in the Trotskyite show trials of the 1930s. Nor are they inconsistent with the Grusenberg case. On the other hand, the only known direct link between Trotsky and international banking is through his cousin Abram Giatovzo, who was a private banker in Kiev before the Russian Revolution and in Stockholm after the revolution. While Giatovzo professed anti-Bolshevism, he was in fact acting in behalf of the Soviets in 1918 in currency transactions. See page 122. Is it possible an international web can be spun from these events? First, there's Trotsky, a Russian internationalist revolutionary with German connections who sparks assistance from two supposed supporters of Prince Lvov's government in Russia, Leninnikov and Wolf, Russian resident in New York. These two ignite the action of a liberal Canadian deputy postmaster general, who in turn intercedes with a prominent British Army Major General on the Canadian military staff. These are all verifiable links. In brief, alliances may not always be what they are called, or appear. We can, however, surmise that Trotsky, Leninnikov, Wolf, Coulter, and Gautkin, in acting for a common limited objective, also had some common higher goal than national allegiance or political label. To emphasize, there is no absolute proof that this is so. It is at the moment only a logical supposition from the facts. A loyalty higher than that forged by a common immediate goal need have been no more than that of friendship, although that strains the imagination when we ponder such a polyglot combination, and may also have been promoted by other motives. The picture is yet incomplete. Chapter 3. Lenin and German assistance for the Bolshevik Revolution. It was not until the Bolsheviks had received from us a steady flow of funds through various channels and under varying labels that they were in a position to be able to build up their main organ, Pravda, to conduct energetic propaganda, and appreciably to extend the originally narrow base of their party. Von Kuhlmann, Minister of Foreign Affairs to the Kaiser, December 3, 1917. In April 1917, Lenin and a party of 32 Russian revolutionaries, mostly Bolsheviks, journeyed by train from Switzerland across Germany through Sweden to Petrograd, Russia. They were on their way to join Leon Trotsky to, quote, complete the revolution, unquote. Their Germany transit was approved, facilitated and financed by the German General Staff. Lenin's transit to Russia was part of a plan approved by the German Supreme Command, apparently not immediately known to the Kaiser, to aid in the disintegration of the Russian army and so eliminate Russia from World War I. The possibility that the Bolsheviks might be turned against Germany and Europe did not occur to the German General Staff. Major General Hoffman has written, quote, "We neither knew nor foresaw the danger to humanity from the consequences of this journey of the Bolsheviks to Russia." Max Hoffman, War Diaries and Other Papers, London, M. Secker, 1929, 177. At the highest level, the German political officer who approved Lenin's journey to Russia was Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, a descendant of the Frankfurt banking family. Bethmann which achieved great prosperity in the 19th century. Bethmann-Hollweg was appointed Chancellor in 1909, and in November 1913 became the subject of the first vote of censure ever passed by the German Reichstag on a chancellor. It was Bethmann-Hollweg who in 1914 told the world that the German guarantee to Belgium was a mere, quote, scrap of paper, unquote. Yet on other war matters, such as the use of unrestricted submarine warfare, Bethmann-Hollweg was ambivalent. In January 1917, he told the Kaiser, quote, "I can give your majesty neither my assent to the unrestricted submarine warfare nor my refusal," unquote. By 1917, Bethmann-Hollweg had lost the Reichstag's support and resigned, but not before approving transit to Bolshevik revolutionaries to Russia. The transit instructions from Bethmann-Hollweg went through the State Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, who was immediately under Bethmann-Hollweg and who handled day-to-day operational details with the German ministers in both Bern and Copenhagen, to the German minister to Bern in early April 1917. The Kaiser himself was not aware of the revolutionary movement until after Lenin had passed into Russia. While Lenin himself did not know the precise source of the assistance, he certainly knew that the German government was providing some funding. There were, however, intermediate links between the German Foreign Ministry and Lenin, as the following shows. From Berlin, Zimmermann and Bethmann-Hollweg communicated with the German minister in Copenhagen. Brockdorff-Rantzau, in turn, Brockdorff-Rantzau was in touch with Alexander Israel Halpand, more commonly known by his alias, Parvis, who was located in Copenhagen. Z.A.B. Zaman and W.B. Charlot, The Merchant of Revolution, The Life of Alexander Israel Halpand, Parvis, 1867 through 1924, New York, Oxford University Press, 1965. Parvis was the connection to Jacob Furstenberg, a Pole descended from a wealthy family but better known by his alias, Kanetsky, and Jacob Furstenberg was the immediate link to Lenin. Although Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg was the final authority for Lenin's transfer, and although Lenin was probably aware of the German origins of the assistance, Lenin cannot be termed a German agent. The German Foreign Ministry assessed Lenin's probable actions in Russia as being consistent with their own objectives in the dissolution of the existing power structure in Russia. Yet, both parties also had hidden objectives. Germany wanted priority access to the post-war markets in Russia, and Lenin intended to establish a Marxist dictatorship. The idea of using Russian revolutionaries in this way can be traced back to 1915. On August 14th of that year, Brockdorff Rantzau wrote the German State Undersecretary about a conversation with Helfand and made a strong recommendation to employ Helfand. Quote, an extraordinarily important man whose unusual powers I feel we must employ for duration of the war. Z.A.B. Zeman, Germany and the Revolution in Russia, 1915 through 1918. Documents from the archives of the German Foreign Minister, London, Oxford University Press, 1958. Pages 4, Doc 5. Included in the report was a warning. Quote, it might perhaps be risky to want to use the powers ranged behind Helfand, but it would certainly be an admission of our own weakness if we were to refuse their services out of fear of not being able to direct them. IBID. Brockdorff Rantzau's ideas of directing or controlling the revolutionaries parallel, as we shall see, those of the Wall Street financiers. It was J.P. Morgan and the American International Corporation that had attempted to control both domestic and foreign revolutionaries in the United States for their own purposes. A subsequent document, IBID page 6, Doc 6, reporting conversation with the Estonian intermediary Keskula, outlined the terms demanded by Lenin, of which the most interesting was point number 7, which allowed, quote, Russian troops to move into India, unquote. This suggested that Lenin intended to continue the Tsarist expansionist program. Zeman also records the role of Max Warburg in establishing a Russian publishing house and adverts to an agreement dated August 12, 1916, in which the German industrialist Steins agreed to contribute 2 million rubles for financing a publishing house in Russia. IBID, page 92 and 3. Consequently, on April 16, 1917, a trainload of 32, including Lenin, his wife Nadia Krupskaya, Grigory Zinoviev, Sokolnikov, and Karl Radek, left the central station in Bern en route to Stockholm. When the party reached the Russian frontier, only Fritz Platen and Radek were denied entrance into Russia. The remainder of the party was allowed to enter. Several months later, they were followed by almost 200 Mensheviks, including Martov and Axelrod. It is worth noting that Trotsky, at the time in New York, also had funds traceable to German sources. Further, von Kuhlmann alludes to Lenin's inability to broaden the base of his Bolshevik party until the Germans supplied funds. Trotsky was a Menshevik who turned to Bolshevik only in 1917. This suggests that German funds were perhaps related to Trotsky's change of party label. The Sijon documents. In early 19, Edgar Sijon, the Petrograd representative of the United States Committee on Public Information, bought a batch of Russian documents purporting to prove that Trotsky, Lenin, and the other Bolshevik revolutionaries were not only in the pay of, but also agents of, the German government. These documents, later dubbed the Sutton documents, were shipped to the United States in great haste and secrecy. In Washington, D.C., they were submitted to the National Board for Historical Service for authentication. Two prominent historians, J. Franklin Jameson and Samuel N. Harper, testified to the genuineness. These historians divided the Sutton papers into three groups. Regarding Group 1, they concluded, "We have subjected them with great care to all the applicable tests to which historical students are accustomed, and, upon the basis of these investigations, we have no hesitation in declaring that we see no reason to doubt the genuineness or authenticity of these 53 documents." U.S. Committee on Public Information, The German Bolshevik Conspiracy, War Information Series, number 20, October 1918. The historians were less confident about material in Group 2. This group was not rejected as outright forgeries, but it was suggested that they were copies of original documents. Although the historians made, quote, "no confident declaration," unquote, on Group 3, they were not prepared to reject the documents as outright forgeries. The Sutton documents were published by the Committee on Public Information, whose chairman was George Creel, a former contributor to the pro-Bolshevik masses. The American press in general accepted the documents as authentic. The notable exception was the New York Evening Post, at that time owned by Thomas W. Lamont, a partner in the Morgan firm. When only a few installments had been published, the Post challenged the authenticity of all of the documents. New York Evening Post, September 16, 1821. October 4, 1918. It is also interesting, but not conclusive of anything, that the Bolsheviks also stoutly questioned the authenticity of the documents. We now know that the Sutton documents were almost all forgeries. Only one or two of the minor German circulars were genuine. Even casual examination of the German letterhead suggests that the forgers were unusually careless forgers, perhaps working for the gullible American market. The German text was strewn with terms verging on the ridiculous. For example, bureau instead of the German word Büro. Central for the German Zentral, etc. That the documents are forgeries is the conclusion of an exhaustive study by George F. Kennan, The Sutton Documents, Journal of Modern History, 27 through 28, 1955 through 56, 130 through 154, and of studies made in the 1920s by the British government. Some documents were based on authentic information, and, as Kennan observes, those who forged them certainly had access to some unusually good information. For example, documents 1, 54, 61, and 67 mention that the Nya Banken in Stockholm served as the conduit for Bolshevik funds from Germany. This conduit has been confirmed in more reliable sources. Documents 54, 63, and 64 mention Furstenberg as the banker intermediary between the Germans and the Bolshevists. Furstenberg's name appears elsewhere in authentic documents. Sutton's document 54 mentions Olof Aschberg, and Olof Aschberg, by his own statement, was the Bolshevik banker. Aschberg, in 1917, was the director of Nya Banken. Other documents in the Sutton series list names and institutions, such as the German Naphtha Industrial Bank, the Diskonto Gesellschaft, and Max Warburg, the Hamburg banker, but hard supportive evidence is more elusive. In general, the Sutton documents, while themselves outright forgeries, are nonetheless based partly on generally authentic information. One puzzling aspect in the light of the story in this book is that the documents came to Edgar Sutton from Alexander Gutenberg, alias Berg, real name Michael Grusenberg, the Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia and later confidential assistant to Chase National Bank, and Floyd Udlum of Atlas Corporation. The Bolshevists, on the other hand, stridently repudiated the Sutton material. So did John Reed, the American representative on the executive of the Third International, and whose paycheck came from Metropolitan magazine, which was owned by J.P. Morgan interests. John Reed, The Sutton Documents, New York Liberator Publishing, N.D. So did Thomas Lamont, the Morgan partner who owned the New York Evening Post. There are several possible explanations. Probably the connections between the Morgan interests in New York and such agents as John Reed and Alexander Gutenberg were highly flexible. This could have been a Gutenberg maneuver to discredit Sutton and Creel by planting forged documents, or perhaps Gutenberg was working in his own interest. The Sutton documents, quote, prove, unquote, exclusive German involvement with the Bolsheviks. They also have been used to, quote, prove, unquote, a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy theory along the lines of that of the Protocols of Zion. In 1918, the U.S. government wanted to unite American opinion behind an unpopular war with Germany, and the Sutton documents dramatically, quote, proved, unquote, the exclusive complicity of Germany with the Bolshevists. The documents also proved a smokescreen against public knowledge of the events to be described in this book. The tug of war in Washington. This part is based on Section 861, period 00 of the U.S. State Department decimal file, also available as National Archives Rolls 10 and 11 of Microcopy 316. I need light. I need additional light. A review of documents in the State Department decimal file suggests that the State Department Ambassador Francis in Petrograd were quite well informed about the intentions and progress of the Bolshevik movement. In the summer of 1917, for example, the State Department wanted to stop the departure from the U.S. of, quote, injurious persons, unquote. That is, returning Russian revolutionaries, but was unable to do so because they were using new Russian and American passports. The preparations for the Bolshevik Revolution itself were well known at least 6 weeks before it came out. One report in the State Department files states, in regard to the Kerensky forces, that is, that it was, quote, doubtful whether government can suppress outbreak, unquote. This integration of the Kerensky government was reported throughout September and October, as were Bolshevik preparations for a coup. The British government warned British residents in Russia to leave at least 6 weeks before the Bolshevik phase of the revolution. The first full report of the events of early November reached Washington on December 9, 1917. This report described the low-key nature of the revolution itself, mentioned that General William V. Judson had made an unauthorized visit to Trotsky, and pointed out the presence of Germans in Smolny, the Soviet headquarters. On November 28, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson ordered no interference with the Bolshevik Revolution. This instruction was apparently in response to a request by Ambassador Francis for an Allied conference, to which Britain had already agreed. The State Department argued that such a conference was impractical. There were discussions in Paris between the Allies, and Colonel Edward M. House reported these to Woodrow Wilson as, quote, long and frequent discussions on Russia, unquote. Regarding such a conference, House stated that England was, quote, passively willing, unquote. France, quote, indifferently against, unquote, and Italy actively so, unquote. Woodrow Wilson shortly thereafter approved a cable authored by Secretary of State Robert Lansing, which provided financial assistance for the Caledon movement, December 12, 1917. There were also rumors filtering into Washington that, quote, monarchists working with the Bolsheviks and same supported by various occurrences and circumstances, unquote. That the Smolny government was absolutely under control of the German General Staff, and rumors elsewhere that, quote, many or most of them, that is Bolshevists, are from America, unquote. In December, General Judson again visited Trotsky. This was looked upon as a step towards recognition by the U.S., although a report dated February 5, 1918, from Ambassador Francis to Washington recommended against recognition. A memorandum originating with Basil Miles in Washington argued that, quote, we should deal with all authorities in Russia, including Bolsheviks, unquote. And on February 15th, 1918, the State Department called Ambassador Francis in Petrograd, stating that, quote, department desires you gradually to keep in somewhat closer and informal touch with the Bolshevik authorities, using such channels as will avoid any official recognition, unquote. The next day, Secretary of State Lansing conveyed the following to the French ambassador J.J. Jourson in Washington, quote, it is considered inadvisable to take any action which will antagonize at this time any of the various elements of the people which now control the power in Russia, unquote. U.S. State Department Decimal File 861.00/117A. The same message was conveyed to the Italian ambassador. On February 20th, Ambassador Francis cabled Washington to report the approaching end of the Bolshevik government. 2 weeks later, on March 7, 1918, Arthur Bullard reported to Colonel House that German money was subsidizing the Bolsheviks, and that this subsidy was more substantial than previously thought. Arthur Bullard of the U.S. Committee on Public Information argued, quote, we ought to be ready to help any honest national government, but men or money or equipment sent to the present rulers of Russia will be used against Russians at least as much as against Germans, unquote. See Arthur Bullard Papers at Princeton University. This was followed by another message from Bullard to Colonel House, quote, I strongly advise against giving material help to the present Russian government. Sinister elements and Soviets seem to be gaining control, unquote. But there were influential counterforces at work as early as November 28, 1917. Colonel House cabled President Woodrow Wilson from Paris that it was, quote, exceedingly important, unquote, that U.S. newspaper comments advocating that, quote, Russia should be treated as an enemy, unquote, be suppressed. Then, next month, William Franklin Sands, Executive Secretary of the Morgan-controlled American International Corporation, and a friend of the previously mentioned Basil Miles, submitted a memorandum that described Lenin and Trotsky as appealing to the masses and that urged the United States to recognize Russia. Even American socialist Walling complained to the Department of State about the pro-Soviet attitude of George Creel of the United States Committee on Public Information, Herbert Swope, and William Boyce Thompson of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. On December 17, 1917, there appeared in a Moscow newspaper an attack on Red Cross Colonel Raymond Robbins and Thompson, alleging a link between the Russian Revolution and American bankers. Quote, "Why are they so interested in enlightenment? Why was the money given the socialist revolutionaries and not to the constitutional Democrats? One would suppose the latter nearer and dearer to hearts of bankers." Unquote. The article goes on to argue that this was because American capital viewed Russia as a future market and thus wanted to get a firm foothold. The money was given to the revolutionaries because, quote, "The backward working men and peasants trust the social revolutionaries. At the time when the money was passed, the social revolutionaries were in power, and it was supposed they would remain in control in Russia for some time." Unquote. Another report, dated December 12, 1917, and relating to Raymond Robbins, details, quote, "negotiation with a group of American bankers on the American Red Cross mission," unquote. The, quote, "negotiation," unquote, related to a payment of $2 million. On January 22, 1918, Robert L. Owen, chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, and linked to Wall Street interests, sent a letter to Woodrow Wilson recommending de facto recognition of Russia, permission for a shipload of goods urgently needed in Russia, the appointment of representatives to Russia to offset German influence, and the establishment of a career service group in Russia. This approach was consistently aided by Raymond Robbins in Russia. For example, on February 15, 1918, a cable from Robbins in Petrograd to Davison in the Red Cross in Washington, and to be forwarded to William Boyce Thompson, argued that support be given to the Bolshevik authority for as long as possible, and that the new revolutionary Russia will turn to the United States as it has, quote, "broken with the German imperialism," unquote. According to Robbins, the Bolsheviks wanted United States assistance and cooperation together with railroad reorganization because, quote, "by generous assistance and technical advice in reorganizing commerce and industry, America may entirely exclude German commerce during balance of war," unquote. In brief, the tug of war in Washington reflected a struggle between, on one side, old-line diplomats such as Ambassador Francis and lower-level departmental officials, and, on the other, financiers like Robbins, Thompson, and Sands, with allies such as Lansing and Miles in the State Department and Senator Owen in the Congress. Chapter 4, Wall Street and World Revolution. What you radicals, and we who hold opposing views differ about, is not so much the end as the means, not so much what should be brought about as how it should and can be brought about. Otto H. Kahn, Director, American International Corp. And partner, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., speaking to the League for Industrial Democracy, New York, December 30, 1924. Before World War I, The financial and business structure of the United States was dominated by two conglomerates, Standard Oil, or the Rockefeller Enterprise, and the Morgan complex of industries, finance, and transportation companies. Rockefeller and Morgan trust alliances dominated not only Wall Street, but through interlocking directorships, almost the entire economic fabric of the United States. John Moody, The Truth About the Trusts, New York, Moody Publishing, 1904. Rockefeller interests monopolized the petroleum and allied industries and controlled the Copper Trust, the Smelters Trust, and the gigantic Tobacco Trust, in addition to having influence in some Morgan properties, such as the United States Steel Corporation, as well as in hundreds of smaller industrial trusts, public service corporations, railroads, and banking institutions. National City Bank was the largest of the banks influenced by Standard Oil, Rockefeller, but financial control extended to the United States Trust Company and the Hanover National Bank, as well as to major life insurance companies, Equitable Life and Mutual of New York. The great Morgan enterprises were in steel, shipping, and the electrical industry. They included General Electric, the Rubber Trust, and railroads. Like Rockefeller, Morgan controlled financial corporations, the National Bank of Commerce, the Chase National Bank, New York Life Insurance, and the Guaranty Trust Company. The names J.P. Morgan and Guaranty Trust Company occur repeatedly throughout this book. In the early part of the 20th century, the Guaranty Trust Company was dominated by the Harriman interests. With the elder Harriman, Edward Henry, when the elderman Harriman, Edward Henry, died in 1909, Morgan and Associates bought into Guaranty Trust as well into Mutual Life and New York Life. In 1919, Morgan also bought control of Equitable Life, and the Guaranty Trust Company absorbed an additional 6 lesser trust companies. Therefore, at the end of World War I, the Guaranty Trust and Bankers Trust were, respectively, the first and second largest trust companies in the United States, both dominated by Morgan interests. The J.P. Morgan Company was originally founded in London as George Peabody and Company in 1838. It was not incorporated until March 21, 1940. The company ceased to exist in April 1954 when it merged with the Guaranty Trust Company and its most important commercial bank subsidiary, and is today known as the Morgan Guaranty Trust Company of New York. American financiers associated with these groups were involved in financing revolution even before 1917. Intervention by the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell into the Panama Canal controversy is recorded in 1913 congressional hearings. The episode is summarized by Congressman Rainey. Quote, "It is my contention that the representatives of this government, United States, made possible the revolution of the Isthmus of Panama, that had it not been for the interference of this government, a successful revolution could not be possibly have occurred. And I contend that this government violated the Treaty of 1846. I will be able to produce evidence to show that the Declaration of Independence, which was promulgated in Panama on the 3rd day of November 1903, was prepared right here in New York City and carried down there, prepared in the office of Wilson, Nelson, Cromwell. United States House Committee on Foreign Affairs, The Story of Panama, Hearings on the Rainey Resolution, 1913, page 53. Congressman Rainey went on to state that only 10 or 12 of the top Panamanian revolutionists, plus, quote, the officers of the Panama Railroad and Steamship Company, who were under the control of William Nelson Cromwell of New York and the State Department officials in Washington, quote, knew about the impending revolution. IBID, page 60. The purpose of the revolution was to deprive Colombia, of which Panama was then a part, of 40 million, and to acquire control of the Panama Canal. The best documented example of Wall Street intervention and revolution is the operation of a New York syndicate in the Chinese Revolution of 1912, which was led by Sun Yat-sen. Although the final gains of the syndicate remain unclear, the intention and role of the New York financing group are fully documented down to the amounts of money, information on affiliated Chinese secret societies, and shipping lists of armaments to be purchased. The New York bankers syndicate for the Sun Yat-sen Revolution included Charles B. Hill, an attorney with the law firm of Hunt, Hill, and Betts. In 1912, the firm was located at 165 Broadway, New York. But in 1917, it moved to 120 Broadway. See Chapter 8 for the significance of this address. Charles B. Hill was director of several Westinghouse subsidiaries, including Bryan Electric, Perkins Electric Switch, and Westinghouse Lamp, all affiliated with Westinghouse Electric, whose New York office was also located at 120 Broadway. Charles R. Crane, organizer of Westinghouse subsidiaries in Russia, had a known role for the first and second phases of the Bolshevik Revolution. See page 26. The work of the 1910 Hill Syndicate in China is recorded in the Lawrence Booth Papers at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, California. See also the Los Angeles Times, October 13, 1966. These papers contain over 110 related items, including letters of Sun Yat-sen to and from his American backers. In return for financial support, Sun Yat-sen promised the Hill Syndicate railroad, banking, and commercial concessions in the new revolutionary China. Another case of revolution supported by New York financial institutions concerned that of Mexico in 1915 through 16. Von Richthofen, a German espionage agent in the United States, later co-director with Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's banker, and Emil Wittenberg of the National Bank for Deutschland, was accused during his May 1917 trial in New York City of attempting to, quote, embroil, unquote, the U.S. with Mexico and Japan in order to divert ammunition then following to the Allies in Europe. United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Investigation of Mexican Affairs, 1920. Payment for the ammunition that was shipped from the United States to the Mexican Revolutionary Pancho Villa was made through the Guarantee Trust Company. Von Rintlin's advisor, Summerfield, paid $380,000 via Guarantee Trust and Mississippi Valley Trust Company to the Western Cartridge Company of Alton, Illinois, for ammunition shipped to El Paso for forwarding to Villa. This was in mid-1915. On January 10, 1916, Villa murdered 17 American miners at Santa Isabel, and on March 9, 1916, Villa raided Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 18 more Americans. Wall Street involvement in these Mexican border raids was the subject of a letter, October 6, 1916, from Lincoln Steffens, an American communist, to Colonel House, an aide to Woodrow Wilson. My dear Colonel House, just before I left New York last Monday, I was told convincingly that Wall Street had completed arrangements for one more raid of Mexican bandits into the United States. To be so timed and so atrocious that it would settle the election. Lincoln Steffens, The Letters of Lincoln Steffens, New York, Harcourt, Brace, 1941, 1-386. Once in power in Mexico, the Carranza government purchased additional arms in the United States. The American Gun Company contracted to ship 5,000 Mausers, and a shipment license was issued by the War Trade Board for 15,000 guns and 15 million rounds of ammunition. The American ambassador to Mexico, Fletcher, quote, flatly refused to recommend or sanction the shipment of any munitions, rifles, etc. to Carranza, unquote. U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Investigation of Mexican Affairs, 1920, Parts 218, page 681. However, intervention by Secretary of State Robert Lansing reduced the barrier to one of the temporary delay, and, quote, in a short while, the American Gun Company would be permitted to make the shipment and deliver, unquote. IBID. The raids upon the U.S. by the Villa and the Carranza forces were reported in the New York Times as, quote, Texas Revolution, unquote, a kind of dry run for the Bolshevik Revolution, and were undertaken jointly by Germans and Bolsheviks. The testimony of John A. Walls, District Attorney of Brownsville, Texas, before the 1919 Fall Committee yielded documentary evidence of the link between Bolshevik interests in the United States, German activity, and the Carranza forces in Mexico. New York Times, January 23, 1919. Consequently, the Carranza government, the first in the world with a Soviet-type constitution, which was written by Trotskyites, was a government with support on Wall Street. The Carranza Revolution probably could never have succeeded without American munitions, and Carranza would not have remained in power as long as he did without American help. U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Op. Cite, pages 795 through 96. Similar intervention in 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia revolves around Swedish banker and intermediary Olof Ashberg. Logically, the story begins with pre-revolutionary Tsarist loans by Wall Street bank syndicates. I think we'll stop there. Thanks for being here.